Just, just to confirm, you're recording this. It's just that, well, that wasn't mentioned before me coming here. Recording it, I mean. I'm not being investigated for anything, am I? We're not doing this, under caution. I'm sorry. I'm just not used to being one who's sat this side of the table. My name? Right, of course. Martin Randall. Detective Constable 4422 Randall, West Yorkshire Constabulary, formerly the West Riding Constabulary. I know, it's confusing. They keep changing the bloody name all the time. Yes, I do recognise that. That's the file I've been working on for this. Whatever this is. No, it's never been submitted, not formally. I mean, could you imagine? Where did all this start? This idea there's some balmy killer out there who can't die? Someone who's been wandering the earth for all eternity? You'll probably laugh. It all started at a barbecue, of all places. The wife, you see, she's a lot cleverer than me. Lectures history over at the university. And the kind of people she hangs about with, well, I wouldn't normally bump into them. Not least they've been burgled anyway. So one summer, a couple of years back, we're having this barbecue out in the back garden. Typical British summer it was. Cold, overcast, kids running around everywhere bumping into things. And I get talking to one of the lecturers she works with. He's telling me this story. He's heard on a course in London. Something that does the rounds at the university down there. Queen Mary's. One of their lecturers back in the 1800s thought he'd tracked down Jack the Ripper, and he ended up getting himself murdered in the process. Anyway, after a couple of drinks, he's still going on about this bloody story. Says I could be the one to crack it wide open, being a copper and all. In truth, I didn't think much of it. Just figured it with a beer talking. Until following week, when the missus comes home, carrying this massive folder he's had sent to her. When I first looked at it, on one of my days off, I thought it was some kind of wind-up. There was random papers, from every time and place, all taped and jumbled up. Took me a fair old time to put it back together again. But the more I did, the more curious I got. It all centred around this lecturer, who'd apparently been murdered, way back when. Chap by the name of Sebastian Bennett. From reading his papers, this Bennett was something of a character, to say the least. Reckoned he'd not only identified the Ripper, but he'd also tracked the same fella down back through the ages, that he was some, well, immortal serial killer. When I read that, I was this close to walking away from it. But there was something that kept pulling me back. On the off chance, I made a call to a fella I'd joined the job with, one who'd transferred down to Metropolitan Police a couple of years back. Asked if they had a record section he could access, to see if this Bennett case were real or not. Couldn't believe it when he called me back a week later. The professor had been real, all right, and his case was still technically open. The Met had, well, still have I guess, a report into the deaths of Dr. Sebastian and Isla Bennett. Both of them were found murdered at their home in Spitalfields in February 1891. There were no clues to the attacker, and it would all have been closed off if it weren't for a copper who'd been involved in the investigation. A sergeant, name of Hargreaves. He was one of the detectives who'd worked the original Ripper case. Poor bugger had found his missus and daughter killed not long after the Bennetts, and he ended up being put in an asylum as a result. They could never prove he'd killed anybody, and the stories he told about some local doctor being responsible, well, they never came to out either. But there was something about it all that made me wonder, particularly when I found out there'd been contact between Hargreaves and the Bennetts just before they died. Our Mrs. Bennett had shown Sergeant Hargreaves the same papers I were looking at now, and how he hadn't been able to let go of it either. The first trace of this chap, this killer that Bennett had found, came from Roman times. In particular, a big battle had happened in Germany. I'm practically a qualified historian myself now after reading up on the blooming Roman Empire. Teutoburg was the name of it. Took place around 9 or 10 AD. 3 Roman legions went and marched themselves into a great big forest to put down a rebellion, ended up being ambushed and killed. There weren't many walked back out of that forest, save for a couple who'd managed to avoid being captured, and only one of them were an officer, a chap called Varus, who reappeared after a couple of days, totally covered in blood, none of which it turned out seemed to be his. Bennett goes on to find further mentions of this Lucius Varus elsewhere in other military reports from Roman times. That same chap's supposed to have led an expedition out into the middle of nowhere, from some remote outpost at the top end of Holland, sometime AD 29. What's weird is Bennett found references in that report to mermen, or sea folk, and then he notes down the unit Varus was part of disappears, completely from any other records. Varus, presumably same one, then gets mentioned 11 years later, in the diary of a centurion named Arius, who was garrisoned at Casinum back in Italy. Those papers are pretty odd too. They make reference to this Varus defeating a dark evil that resides in the depths of the mountain there, some shifting and shape-changing shadow monster that savaged and consumed everyone who challenged it, except Varus, who manages to kill it somehow. At that point, Arius' diary comes to a pretty abrupt end shortly after. The last reference Bennett finds of him is 455 AD. He was dispatched by leadership of Rome to escort something valuable out the city, just before it fell to the Vandals. I mean, at that point, this Varus would have to be over 400 years old, if it was same fella, which Bennett thinks it were. Because once again, the Roman chap who's writing about him suddenly disappears from history, as soon as he makes reference to having encountered Varus, which is what seems to happen to everybody who bloody meets him. Bennett goes on to identify a couple of other instances of men who fit the description of this Lucius Varus, all described as having blonde hair and blue eyes, using the same initials. Some, if I'm honest, are a bit hit and miss, but there are more than a few where the stuff going on at the time, or the way that he's been linked to it, did make me wonder. The first one comes from the Spanish Inquisition of all things, relates to a confession by a nobleman called Galvez. Turns out he'd been a junior officer in the army of Hernan Cortes, who defeated the Aztecs in 1520. Galvez had been captured by the Aztecs when Cortes and his men had been fleeing the city, and he'd been sentenced to death. Poor bugger had to sit and watch for several days, as everyone who'd been captured with him was marched up a pyramid, had their hearts cut out while they were still breathing. Bloody horrible. Then before they can kill him, Galvez and a couple of the others are rescued by another officer called Varus. But when he gets home years later, long after they've beaten the Aztecs, Galvez goes straight to authorities to tell them about Varus. Tells them how this Varus was one of the ones he'd seen having his heart cut out by the Aztecs, but he'd somehow sprung up back to life again. And after how the Spaniards escaped and gone back into the city, he saw Varus cutting the hearts out of Aztec prisoners and eating them while they were still beating. Bennett then somehow managed to unearth some other records about a church-ordered raid in Badajoz, where the army found a villa full of mutilated and desecrated bodies. The owner of that property? A nobleman called Varus, who disappears from the history books not long after his home gets raided. A few of the stories that Bennett goes on to cite came from here, in the UK. Maybe we're just better at keeping history records than everybody else. There was some clan up in Scotland, used to capture travellers, what went up the road near where they lived. The Bean clan they were called. I know, it doesn't sound that scary. But what is scary is apparently they used to eat people after they'd ambushed and robbed them. That was during 1500s, not a long time after that story I told you about from Spain. Anyway, the King of Scotland sends hunters and soldiers to try and wipe this lot out. Everything fails. Then this mercenary walks into his court. European fella, who introduces himself to the king as Vitelli. Says he's heard about the cannibal problem and he can fix it. Free of charge. Don't want a penny. Just a parcel of land so he can build a house on it. The king practically takes his hand off. So off Vitelli goes. And a couple of weeks later, he's solved problem. Somehow managed to kill most of the clan and led what was left back into town to be executed, including their leader. Anyway, Bennett also has copies of records from the time that had been buried away in some private library up in Scotland that he'd gone to. And these showed before they were executed, the Beans all claimed this Vitelli had been using them for his own means. It were him who'd approached them from the start, turned them from simple brigands into murderous cannibals. Then he'd turned on them, and he'd set them up, just pretending to serve king. And in fact, he were as bad as the rest of them. Anyway, nobody believed him, and they was all hanged, drawn and quartered. And once again, this Vitelli then disappears altogether. There were a couple of other sets of records that Bennett had highlighted from London during the 1600s. They all related to disappearances and murders that would look a little bit like the Ripper ones later, and they end in 1666 with Great Fire of London. It were assumed whoever had been doing them had been killed in the fire, but Bennett singled out a grisly story about a local surgeon named Virgil. He'd been arrested and then hanged because he'd been caught eating some of the bodies that had been put in the morgue he worked in. But Bennett seems to think it were this Virgil that were doing the killings, and it was in fact this same Varus from Rome. That obviously he didn't die when they hanged him, and he just moved on because they'd caught him in the act, so to speak. Fast forward 100 years or so, there's this testimony that Bennett found from an English spy master called William Wickham. Bit like you, but a couple of years ago, I suppose. He were behind main efforts to try and kill Napoleon Bonaparte, back when the British weren't officially at war with France like. Tried loads of things they did. Tried to bribe the French government into pushing Napoleon out, rallying exiled royals, tried to start rebellions, even paid assassins, and he sent explosives and bombs to rebel groups in France. And that's what this relates to, this testimony. Some assassination attempt in 1800. Turns out Wickham had financed a bomb. Bunch of royalists set off near Napoleon's carriage. Only just missed him. Anyway, after the attempt, Napoleon orders a purge, and the police managed to round up most of the plotters. There's a few survive. They head down to the coast, where Wickham's put a Royal Navy ship to pick them up. Problem is, all except one are dead by the time they get there, and that chap don't last much longer. And as he dies, he tells the crew about this mysterious assassin that's chased him down to the coast. A chap who's not French, but he's managed to worm his way into Napoleon's court. Calls himself the Vasseur, which is like some sort of old landed title, and apparently he used to eat the hearts of the men he'd killed. Sound familiar? This Vasseur fella couldn't be killed himself. Didn't matter where he got shot or stabbed, and he turned out to be a thorn in Wickham's side for years to come, always foiling English plots and killing Wickham's agents, right up to the point Bonaparte and his empire had done away with, years later. I mean, it does sound familiar, right? It's not just me. When Ripper murders happen 60 years later, Bennett goes into overdrive, thinks he's on verge of catching the murderer. He convinces himself his local doctor, Lucas Vernon, is the killer, and he packages everything up to try and hand in to Scotland Yard. Ends up speaking to Sergeant Hargreaves, who sends him on his way. But poor old Mrs. Bennett, she just wants an end to it all. Goes to see the sergeant again behind her husband's back and passes him the papers, without Mr. Bennett knowing. But just as Hargreaves is getting his head round it, the Bennetts both get murdered in their home, horribly so. Hargreaves tries to apprehend Vernon, but the doctor's already on boat to the United States. Only just misses him as the docks, as it happens. Then Hargreaves finds his wife and kid dead, goes mad, telling anyone who'll listen that Vernon's Ripper, ends up getting committed himself for all the murders. A couple of years later, one of his old army buddies, a chap called Greaves, gives these papers back to university. Then they become a talking point for years to come. I know I should have left it, but I couldn't, if only for the thought of what happened to poor old Sergeant Hargreaves and his family. I started to use my wife's contacts to get access to records, to people at universities who could help find what I needed. Unsolved murders, urban legends, anything that fitted profile. And I think I found more references to the same chap. Varus, I mean. As the years go on, and communication between governments and law enforcement agencies improve, it looks like he gets further and further from the limelight. But he's still active. I stumbled across a report that came from a university in Italy about the invasion of Libya, 1911. They were a regiment, got ambushed by the Arabs at a village, Shar al-Shat. All the survivors were tortured and murdered. In the middle of all this, just before the last few prisoners are about to be killed, one of the dead Italian officers suddenly gets back up again. Sound familiar? This chap ends up having a brief dust-up with one of the enemy officers, the only one who wasn't paralysed by fear. Then he walks off into the desert, never to be seen again. The whole thing upsets the Libyans so much they let survivors go, thinking they was cursed or something. Then the report itself gets buried. 11 years later, there's a report from the German police at a village in Brunnen. A team of German coppers had been sent out into the countryside to look for a murderer. Found him, ended up killing him. They brought the body back into town to do an autopsy. The next thing you know, it's the middle of the night and the doctor's surgery catches fire. Townsfolk find the bodies of the doctor and the coppers inside, but the prisoner's missing. There's an investigation, well, not much of one, then they write it all off. Assume this chap must have been part of a gang, and they've killed the coppers and stolen the body to hide their involvement. But part of the file contains a photo that had survived the fire and been found in the surgery. It's of the dead prisoner, and it shows the doctor had recorded seeing a tattoo on one of his shoulders, a Roman one. One suggests he was a member of the 19th Legion, which is one of the 3 that were killed back in the forest in Germany, centuries before. So what if this were him again, Varus, and he's done his usual trick of rising from the dead and killing all the witnesses to hide the evidence? Last thing I found, and this one were a real head-scratcher, come from the middle of the war. The second one, I mean. Another copper and his family had been murdered in Halifax, horribly. He really doesn't seem to like the police, this chap. Bit like Hargreaves, this cop had been trying to solve murders of prostitutes down by the docks, which in themselves looked a bit like the Ripper ones. See how this all fits the bill? He winds up dead in bed with his missus and 2 kids, but there's a daughter that survives, a girl by the name of Jessica. She follows Killer down to the ship in the docks, and bold as brass, she goes on to try and identify him. That ship, the Bickley Bridge, part of a convoy that gets savaged by the Germans, ends up getting sunk. But when survivors get to England, some of them tell a tale about how their doctor had gone mad, killed half the crew with a sword, a Roman-looking sword. His name were Luke. It's not a million miles away from Lucius, is it? And it looks like he ended up going down with ship, because he wasn't among the survivors that made it off. I managed to correlate this Jessica, who turned up in Liverpool, was the same one from Halifax. And after the war, she stayed in UK. Ended up marrying the ship's first mate and settling down with him in Wales. He'd died since, but she was still living in family home just outside of Cardiff. I'm assuming, with what you do for a living, you'll know I went round to speak to her. How she denied everything, called the local old Bill on me. I know, it was stupid. I'm lucky there was understanding about it. But it's frustrating, because I could tell from the look in her eyes, she knew exactly what I was talking about. No, I've not found anything from that point on. And no, I don't know what I was ever going to do with it all. I do wonder, if he spent all this time not being killed, did he really die on that ship? Or is he going to crop up again, somewhere else? If I'm honest, I've lost sleep thinking about it. I wouldn't want to be Jessica Thomas, because if that is the case, from what I've read of this Varus, he rarely leaves loose ends. So what now? Suppose like Hargreaves, I need to go to an asylum as well. Oh, okay. Your boss will be in touch with mine? Seems fair enough. What's his name then? Just so I can let my sergeant know to expect it. Mr. Shepherd? Right. We'll wait and see what he says then. Thanks again.